On April 19, 1861, just days after the fall of Fort Sumter and the beginning of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln ordered a naval blockade of all major southern ports. Economically reliant on cotton exports and imported goods, the South depended on these ports. Home to not only Fort Sumter, but also the largest port in the South, Charleston, South Carolina soon became the focus of the Union blockade. Bombarded by land and blockaded by sea, the city remained defiant but became increasingly short on supplies. By 1864, the situation was so dire that when a railcar arrived carrying a strange contraption, rumors of a new secret weapon flew through the city like wildfire. In the hopes of increasing the success of their blockade runners, Confederate authorities had endeavored to build specialized craft that could attack the blockade ships unseen. Within the Confederacy, a sense of nationalism combined with high bounties placed on Union blockade ships generated great interest in the construction of submersibles. In New Orleans, a group would form comprised of machinists James McClintock and Baxter Watson, as well as lawyer, legislator, customs collector, and Southern planter Horace Lawson Hunley. Motivated like many others by both patriotism and opportunism, they also undertook the creation of a submersible. Acting on principles demonstrated by previous experimental crafts, between 1861 and 1862, they constructed a prototype submarine, the Pioneer, which underwent trials in Lake Pontchartrain. She was 30 feet long and 4 feet in diameter, with dive planes and a propeller at one end, powered by 2 crewmen working a hand crank. The Pioneer never saw action, however, as less than a month later, New Orleans fell to Union forces. An unsuccessful attempt was made to scuttle the sub prior to its discovery by Federal forces, who proceeded to study and then later sell it for scrap. McClintock, Watson, and Hunley fled to Mobile, Alabama. There, they were joined in their efforts by engineers Thomas Park and Thomas Lyons, who provided their facilities for the fabrication of a new boat. Together, in early 1863, they would build a second submersible named American Diver. She was 36 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet high. However, she ultimately proved too slow to be of use against the blockade and later sank in Mobile Bay during a storm. Though her crew managed to escape, she was never recovered. Now strained financially, McClintock and Hunley's group sold shares in the third venture to finance their next creation. It was around this time that Lieutenant George Dixon, a former steamboat engineer and a veteran of the Battle of Shiloh, also joined the project. The group obtained a long cylindrical steam boiler, which the engineers lengthened, deepened, and fitted out to accommodate a maximum crew of 9. The vessel was 40 feet long, 4 feet high, and 4 feet wide in the middle, with 10 portholes. She was fitted with cranks geared to her propeller and turned by 8 persons sitting side by side inside of her. The craft's commander sat in front, handling the steering while navigating by looking out of a conning tower. Water ballast tanks at either end of the craft could be filled and emptied with hand pumps to rise and sink the boat. Capable of cruising at 3 knots or 3.5 miles per hour, she was larger, sleeker, and faster than her 2 predecessors. Then called the fish boat, the fish torpedo boat, or the porpoise, she was launched in July 1863 at Mobile's Theater Street dock and demonstrated such pleasing results that General P.G.T. Beauregard of the Confederate Army would have her shipped by flat car to Charleston, South Carolina in August 1863. There, she was to participate in anti-blockade duty against the ships of the South Atlantic Blocking Squadron. In South Carolina, the boat's builders began making nighttime forays into the harbor. However, after 2 weeks, they had failed to score a hit. Increasingly dissatisfied, the Army eventually seized the boat, replacing the civilian crew with Confederate Navy personnel under the command of one Lieutenant Payne. This would lead to the first of several lethal incidents. One day, when the ship was set to dive into Charleston Harbor, Lieutenant Payne was accidentally caught in the manhole. In trying to get clear, he stepped on the lever controlling the fins, causing the boat to dive with the manholes still open. The submersible quickly filled with water. Payne was able to escape out of the forward hatch, and 2 others out of the aft hatch. One Lieutenant Hasker, however, went down with the boat, alongside 5 others. Hasker had almost gotten through the flooding forward hatch when the manhole plate came down on his back. He worked his way out until his left leg was caught by the plate. He was stuck in this way until the sub hit the bottom of the harbor. Stooping down, he managed to finally lift the manhole plate off his leg and swam 42 feet to the surface. He was the last to escape, the other 5 men having drowned within the sub. 2 weeks later, the divers managed to raise the submarine and extract the bodies. After this incident, the military sent a request to Mobile asking for people more familiar with the boat to take over its operation. Horace Hunley himself, as well as 7 others, volunteered and traveled to Charleston. However, while conducting a test, the boat suffered another terrible disaster. While submerged, Hunley, acting as vessel commander, partly turned the fins to go down, but then thought that he needed more ballast and opened his seacock. The tank quietly flooded, and the boat quickly began to sink. The crew only realized their peril when the water started rising around their feet. They tried to release the iron keel ballast, but did not turn the keys far enough and failed. The water soon forced the air to the top of the boat and into the hatchways, drowning 6 of them. Hitting the harbor bottom, Hunley tried desperately to open the forward hatchway, while another crewman tried to do the same on the aft hatch. However, the pressure proved too great. Trapped with a limited supply of air, the pair soon died of asphyxiation. After the sub was recovered days later, the deceased crew were buried in Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery. The remaining members of the group memorialized Hunley's efforts by naming the boat after him. Initially, General Beauregard refused to let anyone else use it. However, Lieutenant Dixon eventually persuaded him to give it another try. Dixon enlisted another volunteer crew, and between November 1863 and February 1864, they frequently cast off on night cruises on the seas off Charleston. The newly christened H.L. Hunley, no longer towing a contact mine behind herself, was refitted with an adjustable 16-foot spar attached to the front of her hull. Able to be raised or lowered, it carried a firmly bolted copper torpedo filled with 135 pounds of black powder and armed with a pressure-sensitive trigger. Soon, the crew were working for hours, straining to reach the Yankee fleet. They would get maybe 6 or 8 miles offshore, then they would have to turn around and crank all the way back before dawn. Every mission was an endurance test, sunrise sometimes catching the exhausted Confederates still within range of Union guns. The Hunley's crew would continue to struggle to find a target until a lone ship would finally grant Dixon the chance he needed. The Federal steam sloop of war, USS Housatonic, a powerful new vessel, had set itself just 4 miles offshore in the mouth of Charleston Harbor. The cold evening of February 17, 1864, was like every other night, the silence punctuated by the sounds of Union artillery. Shortly after 6 p.m., Hunley would launch into the waters off Charleston Harbor, setting course for the USS Housatonic some 4 miles away. Dixon was at the helm, while behind him, the 7 other crewmen powered the sub's hand-cranked propeller. Meanwhile, aboard the Housatonic, officer of the deck, John Crosby, began his watch at 8 p.m. Roughly 45 minutes later, he saw what he at first thought was a porpoise, coming to the surface about 100 yards from the ship's starboard side. After taking a closer look, however, he saw that it was coming toward the ship unusually fast. Alarmed, he then gave the order for general quarters and to back the ship's engine, the orders being executed almost immediately. Housatonic's commanding officer, Captain Charles W. Pickering, and Lieutenant F.J. Higginson, the ship's executive officer, rushed to the deck. There they found Crosby on the bridge, who pointed off the starboard side to the object. The Hunley was about 30 feet away and 6 feet beneath the surface, moving towards the ship at a rate of 3 or 4 knots. Pickering and Higginson grabbed rifles and opened fire, but to little effect. The captain figured that the vessel was already attaching a torpedo and ran down the quarterdeck as far as the mizzenmast, shouting, "Go astern faster!" Hunley pressed his torpedo against the Housatonic's starboard side well below the waterline, triggering a black powder explosion that blew off Housatonic's aft section and ripped the ship in half, bursting the deck into a million shards of wood and metal. 5 sailors were killed. However, aboard the Hunley, Dixon's head dropped against the side of the hull as he slumped against the wall. Behind him, the rest of the crew quickly began to die in similar fashion. The amount of pressure ricocheting around inside the sub from the sheer proximity to the explosion gave each of them immediate severe pulmonary trauma, enough to knock them out and rupture their lungs. They would have gasped for air, possibly coughing up blood, slumping over, and dying at their posts. The submarine drifted on the outgoing tide. With no one alive to operate the bilge pumps, eventually she started to sink. Water rushed in, bringing the boat to the bottom, where the H.L. Hunley and her crew settled to a quiet grave. As the Housatonic's crew scattered to save themselves, those waiting in Charleston hoping to celebrate her success, never saw Hunley again. The Hunley and her crew never returned. Their fates became one of the Civil War's greatest mysteries. Hunley's success caused serious panic among the Union squadrons. Security was heightened, requiring vessels to be ready to get underway at all times, and forcing them to move further offshore at night, giving blockade runners an easier chance to break through. While such attempts had been underway as early as 1861, it was the Hunley's attack on the Housatonic that proved to both the US Navy, as well as the wider world, the vast potential of submarines in the future of naval warfare. For more than a century, many would wonder over the unknown demise of the Hunley. It wasn't until 1970 that underwater archaeologist E. Lee Spence plotted the ship's location with a compass and maps. Then, in 1995, using Spence's coordinates, divers discovered the lost submarine in 30 feet of water and beneath 3 feet of fine silt on the bottom of the harbor, only 1,000 feet from the spot where she had ambushed Housatonic. On August 8, 2000, the Hunley was carefully lifted from her resting place and moved to a specially prepared tank at the Warren Lash Conservation Center. Researchers began removing the hard, concrete-like sediment within and discovered the crew's bones, which showed, to the surprise of many, that the men made no move to escape. Their deaths were believed to have happened so fast that they were unable to react. Though many speculated that they had succumbed quietly to anoxia or oxygen deprivation, blast injuries were found to be consistent with the way the remains were found, as blast waves would not have left marks on the skeletons and would not have given them a chance to escape. In 2004, a group of 6,000 Civil War reenactors and 4,000 people dressed in 1800s clothing bore the long-lost crew to their new resting place in Charleston at the Magnolia Cemetery. There, they were laid to rest alongside Horace Hunley and his crew. 3 days after the Hunley disappeared, General Beauregard had issued his final order regarding the submarine. Quote, "As soon as its fate shall have been ascertained, pay a proper tribute to the gallantry and patriotism of its crew and officers." That long-standing order was finally fulfilled.